The Salt-Stained Hymnal. Chapter 7. The Chorus of the Drowned. The dream was of water, not the gray, chemical-laced sludge of Benthos, but water as the old data slates described it. Blue, sun-drenched, infinite. He was on a wooden dock, the heat of it soaking through the soles of his feet. His wife, Aerie, was there, her laughter a sound he hadn't truly heard in decades. And Lyra, his daughter, was running, her small hand in his, pulling him toward the impossible horizon. The salt spray was clean on his face. Then the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the dock began to groan, the sound of a dying leviathan. The water turned black. Lyra's hand slipped from his grasp. Joric's eyes snapped open.
She was sitting in the single chair by the window, legs tucked primly beneath her, a small form silhouetted against the sickly green glow of a distant pumping station. She was wearing the yellow dress she'd loved, the one with the little embroidered suns. Her dark hair was braided exactly as Aerie used to do it every morning. She wasn't flickering, she wasn't transparent, she was just there. Joric froze, his heart seizing in a cold fist. This was it. Stage 2. Persistent, complex hallucination. He catalogued it with a detached part of his brain, the forensic theologian taking notes even as the man, the father, threatened to shatter. Subject is interactive with the environment, appears solid, no visible distortion. It was textbook. It was perfect. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another. He kept his breathing even, a practiced technique for dealing with panicking cultists. You are a symptom, he thought, directing it at the small shape. A neurological echo. A protein misfolding in my brain. You are salt rot and bad air. He reached the small nutrient paste synthesizer and keyed in a request for water. The machine whirred, its mundane reality a comforting anchor. He did not take his eyes off the girl in the chair. You aren't real, he said, his voice a dry rasp. The girl turned her head. The movement was fluid, natural. The faint light caught her face, and Joric's breath hitched. It was Lyra's face. Not a memory, not a photograph. Her face, exactly as it was the last time he saw her, 7 years old, forever. Her eyes, wide and dark, fixed on him. "Daddy!" The voice. Salt rot. The voice was perfect. Not a recording playing in his head, but a sound in the sterile air of the room, with acoustics and reverb. It had texture. He could almost feel the vibration of it in his teeth. His clinical detachment began to fracture. That's not possible, he murmured, gripping the edge of the synthesizer. The dispenser chimed, and a bulb of purified water slid into the receptacle. He ignored it. "Why did you leave us?" she asked. Her tone wasn't accusatory. It was a simple, devastating question filled with a child's genuine confusion. "The water came. You were holding my hand. And then you let go."
I didn't let go, Joric snapped, the words torn from him. The wave. He trailed off, shaking his head. No, I am not having this conversation. You are a chemical reaction. You are the murmuration spore expressing itself through my personal trauma to engender a sympathetic response. He recited it like a catechism, the core tenet of his own faith, the faith of meaninglessness. He walked a slow circle around the chair, expecting the image to break apart from a different angle, to reveal the trick. It held. She followed him with her eyes, her head turning on her small neck. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. It was so cold. That stopped him. The cold. He remembered the cold more than the noise, more than the screaming. The impossible, bone-deep cold of the deluge. It was a detail too specific, too sensory. A simple pathogen mimicked. It didn't create with such nuance. This is sophisticated, he conceded, his voice dropping to a near whisper. He felt a perverse sense of professional admiration. A targeted psychological assault. It isolates the most potent memory engrams and— "You always use big words when you're scared," Lyra said, looking up at him again. There was a ghost of a smile on her lips, a mannerism so uniquely hers it felt like a physical blow. "Mommy said you do it so you don't have to feel things." Joric flinched. He stared at her, at the impossible living recreation of his dead daughter. The rational mind, the debunker, was screaming at him. It's a puppet. The fungus is pulling the strings. It's analyzing you, learning. But the father, the hollowed-out man who had survived when he shouldn't have, was drowning. "What do you want?" he asked, the question surrendering a piece of his disbelief. "I want to know why you're hurting us," she said, her voice wavering for the first time. "The songs, they just want to make everyone warm again, safe, like before the water. But you want to make it stop. Why do you want everyone to be cold and alone like you, Daddy?"
His carefully constructed wall of cynicism crumbled into dust. The lingering shock of the initial exposure curdled into something else entirely. A cold, burning rage. This thing, this god of rot and whispers, wasn't just a mindless plague. It was intelligent. It was manipulative. It had burrowed into the deepest, most sacred part of his grief and was wearing his daughter's face as a mask, using her memory as a weapon. He strode to his terminal, his movement sharp, precise. He keyed in a secure comms channel, the glyphs flashing orange in the dark. Kellen's orders were explicit. Quarantine, observe, report. Stay in the Aerie, let the purity sweeps handle the infection on the ground. Salt rot to that. Salt rot to Kellen and his sterile protocols. This was no longer a contract. This was no longer about debunking another pathetic cult to validate his own emptiness. This was an extermination. He was going to trace this signal to its source. He was going to find the heart of this fungal consciousness, and he was going to cut it out. Not for the BCA, not for the lie of structured survivalism. For her. For the memory this thing was desecrating. His call connected. A grainy image of a scarred face appeared on the screen. Morrow Cade, sump diver. The best there was at navigating the drowned hell of the Bloom Deeps. "Morrow," Joric said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I need a guide, now." He turned from the screen. In the corner, the apparition of Lyra was still sitting in the chair. She hadn't vanished. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. He met her gaze, his own eyes hardening into chips of ice. He wouldn't let her go this time. The air in Central Command was a monument to purity. It smelled of nothing, which was the entire point. A faint ozone tang from the atmospheric scrubbers in the ceiling was the only testament to the chemical war being waged against the city below. Here in the Aerie, 82 years of rot and ruin were held at bay by polymer seals, pressurized corridors, and an ideology as sterile as the recycled water. Commander Kellen Rask preferred it this way. Chaos was a contagion, and order was the only cure. He stood before the main tactical holodisplay, a vast, three-dimensional wound bleeding light into the otherwise stark white room. Benthos hung suspended in the manufactured twilight, a skeletal spine of interconnected towers plunging into a murky, simulated sea. Red icons pulsed with the rhythm of a failing heart in the Gamma-9 sector. Uncontained flooding, exponential spore proliferation. The data stream scrolled past his vision, each one a symptom of the city's terminal illness. He traced a finger along the projected boundary of the quarantine zone, the light leaving a cold, shimmering trail on his skin. Structured survivalism wasn't a philosophy. It was a matter of engineering. Humanity was a complex machine, and he was one of its chief technicians. Every citizen was a component, every resource a variable, every crisis a diagnostic test. This new faith, this murmuration, was simply a malfunction, a biological short-circuit that caused critical components to behave erratically. And Joric Cantor was supposed to be the diagnostic tool. The hiss of the pneumatic door opening behind him was a precise, expected sound. Kalen didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the spreading red stain. "Commander," a voice said, tight with the practiced neutrality of a subordinate bearing bad news. "Lieutenant Eva Rostova. Efficient, ambitious, predictable. Good." "Report," Kalen said. His own voice was a low-frequency hum, part of the room's machinery. "It's Asset Cantor, sir. There's an anomaly in his telemetry." Kalen's hand stopped moving. Anomaly, a word for when the machine behaved in a way the schematics did not predict. Irritation, cold and sharp as a shard of pre-deluge glass, pricked at the base of his skull. He had personally authorized Cantor's deployment, a calculated risk. The man was a relic, a forensic theologian, whose entire field of study was anathema to the BCA's doctrine. But his record of dismantling post-collapse cults was unparalleled. He was a scalpel, meant for a precise incision, not for breaking. "Explain anomaly, Lieutenant," he said, finally turning. Rostova stood at perfect attention, her face pale under the harsh UV lamps, a datapad held in her hands like a prayer book. The irony was not lost on him. "Sir, at 0400, Asset Cantor's biosensor went dark. We registered a brief spike in his heart rate, consistent with exertion or distress, then nothing. His tracker? Offline. The unit's casing registered a hard impact just before signal loss. Standard procedure initiated an immediate quarantine lockdown of his assigned HAB unit in the Gill-Racks. Seal was confirmed intact." Kalen's days drifted back to the map. The tool was malfunctioning, so he's contained. Run a remote diagnostic on the HAB's internal sensors. Assess atmospheric spore count and check for structural... "That's the core of the anomaly, sir," Rostova interrupted, then immediately flinched at her own breach of protocol. "Apologies, Commander. The unit's internal logs show the outer door was cycled 20 minutes after Cantor's telemetry failed. The quarantine seal was broken from the inside. He's gone." Silence descended. It was a thick, heavy thing, broken only by the city's deep metronomic pulse, the heartbeat of the great reclamation pumps, a sound so constant it was usually forgotten. Now it seemed to Kalen a countdown. A variable was loose in the system. A compromised component was now moving through the machine, its potential for damage unknown. He walked to his command console, the deck plates humming faintly under his boots. With a few swift, economical gestures, he swiped away the tactical map and pulled up Joric Cantor's dossier. The man's face materialized in the air, gaunt, haunted, a deep-set cynicism in the eyes that Kalen had mistaken for professional detachment. He saw it now for what it was, a fracture point. Psychological profile. Subject exhibits pronounced nihilistic tendencies rooted in familial loss during the final deluge. sole survivor trauma, prone to intellectual arrogance as a defense mechanism, high risk of insubordination if ideological tenets are challenged. Kalin had read the report. He had dismissed the warnings as academic hand-wringing. A man with nothing to believe in was a perfect tool to destroy the beliefs of others. It was logical. It was a miscalculation. He was exposed, Kalin stated. It wasn't a question. The initial spore burst during his entry to the Gill-Racks. We have the logs.
Yes, Commander. Per his own report, a significant direct exposure. He was scheduled for a full-spectrum decontaminant cycle and psych evaluation. An evaluation he has chosen to evade. Kalin's voice was flat, devoid of the irritation he felt. The emotion was an inefficiency, and he purged it. The situation had changed. The objective had changed. Cantor was no longer an asset. He was a threat vector. His unique psychological vulnerabilities, once a utility, were now a gateway for the pathogen. He looked at Rostova, his eyes as cold and unforgiving as the void outside the city's dome. The mission is no longer investigative. It is one of containment. He turned back to the console, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. He brought up a roster for Purity Enforcement Squad Sigma 7. Hardened veterans, unflinching. He tagged their unit. "Issue a Priority 1 directive," he commanded, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more resonant in the sterile chamber. "Objective, recover asset Cantor. He has broken purity protocol and is considered a Class A contamination risk." "Understood, sir," Rostova said, her fingers tapping rapidly on her datapad. Kalin watched Joric's photograph flicker. The man in the picture was already a ghost. He was a piece of data that had become corrupted, and corrupted data is not fixed, it is deleted. "Add a clarifying parameter to the directive, Lieutenant." Rostova let the silence hang, a weight to impress the severity of the order. "If the asset displays any signs of Stage 2 infection, vocal hymning, visible mycelial growth, erratic or non-compliant behavior, the recovery directive is rescinded." Rostova looked up, her professional mask cracking for a barest fraction of a second. She understood. "The objective then defaults to sterilization," Kalin finished, his gaze unwavering. "Lethal force is authorized. Terminate and incinerate. I will not have a rogue theologian becoming a new prophet for this salt rot." "Yes, Commander." The words were clipped, swallowed by the room's oppressive silence. "Dismissed, Lieutenant." The door hissed shut, leaving Kalin alone with the ghost in the machine. He stared at Joric's face for another moment, at the profound, ancient grief etched around his eyes. It was a weakness, a flaw in the material. With a final, decisive gesture, he swiped a finger across the console. The dossier vanished, replaced by a new file, its heading stark and orange. Biothreat 734. Contour. J. The system was purged, the problem was reclassified. Now it only required a solution. The membrane door, a sheet of repurposed oil-slick polymer, slapped shut behind Joric, muffling the rhythmic drip of the Gill-Racks to a dull, distant ache. The air inside was a physical presence. It tasted of rust, sweat, and the cloying sweetness of rot-gut algae ale that clung to the back of the throat. Underneath it all, that other scent, the one he was trained to detect, the one that clung to the lower levels like a shroud, the honeyed decay of the murmuration, faint but undeniable. Structured survivalism had no jurisdiction here. The place called itself the sump pump, according to the flickering orange emergency light that illuminated a crude sign dripping with condensation. It was less a bar and more a wound in the side of a support pylon, a cavern carved from scavenged plating and weeping concrete. Greasy blue light bled from fungal graffiti scrawled on the walls, pulsating, living patterns that cast shifting shadows across the patrons. They were a gallery of the city's forgotten, sump divers. Their faces were maps of pressure scarring and grime, their bodies lean and hard under patched reclamation suits. They moved with a predator's economy of motion, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing. And every single pair of them was now fixed on him. He felt their gaze like a change in atmospheric pressure. He was an anomaly. His BCA issue long coat, though muted in color, was too clean, its fabric engineered to repel the constant damp, not soak it in. He was dry in a world defined by wetness, a creature from another, higher ecosystem that had wandered into the wrong tide pool. His clinical confidence, usually a shield, now felt like a target painted on his back.
Analyze, he told himself, the old training kicking in. Do not react. He catalogued them as he would any cult gathering. No overt signs of the whispering sickness. Their hostility was lucid, not ecstatic. These were not the hymners, lost in their fungal bliss. These were survivors, bottom feeders, people who made a living by plunging into the city's tomb and wresting treasures from the dead, and from the God growing in that tomb. They were exactly what he needed. The low, omnipresent thrum of the city's heartbeat vibrated through the metal floor plates. A man with a milky, cataract-filmed eye watched him from a table, slowly sharpening a long pitted blade on a whetstone. The sound was a rhythmic sh-hink, sh-hink, sh-hink that grated on Joric's nerves. He ignored him and moved towards the bar, a single massive slab of rusted iron that looked salvaged from a pre-deluge freighter hull. The bartender was immense, his bald head and thick arms covered in faded, intricate tattoos of deep-sea leviathans that writhed when he moved. He said nothing, just wiped a smear of something viscous from the bar with a rag that had seen better decades. His silence was an accusation. Joric kept his voice level, the tone he used for hostile witnesses and grieving families, precise, detached. "I need a guide," he said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the room. The bartender stopped wiping. He slowly looked up, his eyes small and dark in the fleshy landscape of his face. For a moment, Joric thought he wouldn't answer. Then a low, gravelly sound rumbled from his chest that might have been a chuckle. "A guide?" he grunted. "You look more like you need a coffin, pure blood." The room erupted in harsh, wet laughter. The sound was mocking, devoid of humor. The man with the blade stopped sharpening it. The tension coiled tighter. Joric didn't flinch. He unsealed a pocket on his wrist interface, the small, clean chime of the device sounding like a bell from another world. "I'm not looking for a tour of the rackways. I'm going into the bloom deeps. I will pay for the best." He projected his chit onto the bar's surface. The number glowed a stark, clean white. 500 Cal-L. 500 calibrated liters of pure water, enough to keep a family hydrated for a month, maybe two. Salt rot. The display was a mistake, a declaration of wealth that was both a lure and an insult. He saw the shift in their eyes. The simple contempt was now alloyed with a greedy, dangerous curiosity. His vulnerability was no longer a feeling, it was a fact, glowing on the bar for all to see. The bartender stared at the number, then spat a thick glob of something onto the floor. The best, huh? He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. The best don't work for Aerie cows. The best know that a man with that much water on him down here is usually a man about to be very, very thirsty. Joric felt his jaw tighten. He was losing control of the encounter. His world was one of protocols, data, and predictable human desperation. This was different. This was primal. "Just give me a name," he said, his voice a low command. The bartender leaned forward, his bulk casting a huge shadow over Joric. The smell of stale ale and unwashed skin was suffocating. "You want the best diver? The one who knows the deeps like the veins on their own hand? The one who comes back when everyone else gets bloomed or drowned?" He looked around the room, a slow, deliberate scan. His gaze settled on a dark corner, far from the weak orange light. "You want Cade." The name hung in the air. The laughter was gone. The whispers died. Even the man with the knife had gone still. The name carried weight, fear, respect. Joric followed the bartender's gaze. In the deepest shadows of the bar, at a small, solitary table, sat a figure. He hadn't noticed them before, which, he realized with a cold knot in his stomach, was probably by design. At first, all he could make out was a silhouette, wiry and still, hunched over something on the table. As his eyes adjusted, details emerged. A woman. Her hair was cropped short, practical. Her face, half hidden in shadow, was sharp angles and hard lines. She wore a patched, pressure-sealed undersuit, its surface scoured and repaired in a dozen places. She wasn't drinking. Instead, she was methodically disassembling and cleaning the intricate trigger mechanism of a spear gun, her fingers moving with a surgeon's precision. Every piece of her kit, from the rebreather unit beside her to the worn coils of synthrope, looked ancient but flawlessly maintained. She hadn't looked up, not once. She seemed utterly absorbed in her work, a pocket of intense, focused silence in the chaotic room. But Joric knew with absolute certainty that she was aware of every breath he took. She was watching him without watching him. This was Moro Kade. He could feel it. She was nothing like the desperate, loud predators filling the rest of the bar. She was the apex, cold, patient. He slid the 500 cal chit from the bar, extinguishing the light, and walked towards her table. The floor plates groaned under his weight. He felt like a clumsy beast wading through a swamp, every step a broadcast of his foreignness. He stopped in front of her table, the scarred metal a demarcation line between their worlds. She didn't acknowledge him. The only sound was the tiny, metallic click of a pin being set back into the trigger housing. Joric cleared his throat. "They say you are the best." Nothing. She picked up a small, oil-stained cloth and began polishing a pressure bearing, her focus absolute. He had to force the next words out. His authority, his title, his life in the sterile spires of the Aerie, it all meant less than nothing here. He was a supplicant.
I need a guide into the bloom deeps. Slowly, deliberately, she put the bearing down. She lifted her head, and for the first time he saw her face clearly. Her skin was pale, crisscrossed with a fine web of white scars around her eyes and mouth, the telltale marks of repeated mask seal failure. But it was her eyes that held him. They were the color of the deep, sunless sea, and they were filled with a weary, profound contempt that made the mockery of the others feel like a caress. She saw not just his clean coat, but everything he was, a pure, a talker, a man who paid others to face the horrors he studied from a safe distance. "The deeps are a grave, Aerie man," she said, her voice low and raspy, like stones grinding together.
The bar called itself the Sump Pump, a name that was less an affectation and more a literal description of its function. It clung to the rust-weeping flank of a central support column like a diseased barnacle, its single room carved from 3 welded-together shipping containers. The air was a thick soup of smells, the ozone tang of a struggling air scrubber frying algae paste that failed to mask the scent of damp metal, and beneath it all the sweet, cloying perfume of fungal rot that was Benthos's signature cologne. The low-frequency hum of the city's water pumps, the heartbeat, vibrated up through the grated floor, a constant subliminal dread. Joric sat hunched over a mug of cloudy synthale, the fabric of his Aerie-grade envirocoat feeling absurdly clean and loud in the gloom. He was an organ transplant rejecting its new body. Every eye in the place had slid over him once upon his entry, cataloging the crisp lines of his gear, the pallor of his skin, the absence of the ingrained weariness that marked the damps. They dismissed him as a BCA stooge or a topside tourist slumming it for a thrill. Both were equally contemptible. His focus was on her. Morwen Cade. Morrow. She sat alone at a corner table, nursing a drink the color of rust. Her profile was sharp, etched by a life of hard choices and little light. Patched sump diver gear hugged a lean frame with a rebreather unit and coils of sin rope slung over the back of her chair. She moved with an economy that spoke of conserved energy and constant threat assessment. She was exactly the guide his contact had described, the best and the least likely to get him killed for his calibrated leaders. He pushed himself to his feet, the synthetic joints in his boots feeling clumsy on the uneven floor. The memory of his daughter's face, a phantom born of spores and grief, flickered at the edge of his vision. He blinked it away, the afterimage a painful shimmer against the greasy green bioluminescence of the bar's lighting. The mission. Focus on the mission. Prove the ghost was just a pathogen. He approached her table. "More Cade?" She didn't look up, just traced a ring of condensation on the metal tabletop with her finger. "Depends who's asking." Her voice was low, gravelly, like stones grinding together in a slow current. "My name is Joric Cantor. I was told you guide passages into the deeps."
Now she looked up. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out gray, took him in again, this time with open derision. A short, sharp sound that was almost a laugh escaped her. "A topsider tourist. Salt rot. You're a long way from home, pure boy. The bloom deeps aren't for sightseeing. The light show eats people." Joric kept his expression neutral, a clinical mask he had perfected over years of debunking weeping statues and holy apparitions. "This isn't for sightseeing. It's a contract, a retrieval job." "Retrieve what? Some pre-deluge trinket your granddad dropped? I'm sure it's very important." She took a slow sip of her drink, dismissing him. He slid a data slate across the table. On it was a single figure, a transfer authorization for 500 calibrated liters. A fortune down here. Enough to live without worry for a year. Enough to buy passage to a higher level, maybe. She glanced at it, her expression unchanged. Not interested. Joric's control frayed. The ghost of his daughter's smile tugged at his mind. She doesn't trust you, Papa. That's a generous offer, he said, his voice tighter than he wanted. It's a stupid offer, she corrected, finally giving him her full attention. Her gaze was unnervingly direct. Nobody offers that much for a simple retrieval unless the job is guaranteed to get the guide killed. So no. Find some other sump-tainted fool to drown for you. She pushed the slate back towards him. He didn't take it. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. The ever-present drip of condensation from a pipe overhead became a metronome marking his desperation. It's not a simple retrieval. It's a survey, an environmental survey. Morrow's lip curled. A survey, right, and I'm the head of the BCA. What are you, Aqua Veritas Corp scouting for new filtration points? A black market botanist hunting for a miracle mold? I don't care. The answer's the same. His patience snapped. The professional debunker, the clinical observer was gone. In his place was the man who had seen his dead daughter smile in a cloud of spores. It's not a survey, he admitted, his voice dropping to just above a whisper. Iniki get out to get to the heart of the Gamma-9 flood zone. Silence. For the first time, a flicker of something other than contempt crossed her face. The casual noise of the bar seemed to recede. Gamma-9 wasn't just a district. It was a wound, a place where the city was actively, violently dying, a place where the whispering sickness was so thick they said you could see the words in the air. You're insane, she stated. It wasn't an insult, but a diagnosis. The pay stands, Joric pressed. 500 cal-L, half now, half on return. Return? She laughed again, a raw, bitter sound this time. There is no return from the heart of Gamma-9. Why? Why would anyone go there? This was it, the point of no return. He couldn't tell her about Silas, about the murmuration, about the forensic theology of it all. He gave her the only truth that would matter to a woman like her, a landmark, a coordinate. He leaned closer still, the sweet rot smell of the air thick in his throat. Cistern Beta 7. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. It was a legendary place now, the epicenter of the pump failure, the source of the flood, the rumored birthplace of the new faith. Going there wasn't just a suicide run, it was a pilgrimage into the mouth of hell. Or heaven, depending on who you asked. Morrow's face was a stone mask. Her knuckles were white where she gripped her mug. She stared at him, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a tourist, but as something far more dangerous, a man with an obsession that defied reason. She was recalculating. The risk was absolute, but the reward was transformative. Slowly, deliberately, she leaned back in her chair, the rusted metal groaning in protest. Her eyes scanned the bar, a reflexive check for eavesdroppers, before locking back onto his. "All right, pure boy," she said, her voice stripped of all its earlier mockery, replaced by something flat and hard as polymer concrete. "I'll take you." Joric felt a surge of relief so profound his knees felt weak. "Good. We leave at—" "I'm not finished," she cut him off, holding up a single finger. "We do this, we do it on my terms only. Are we clear?" He nodded. "Perfectly."
Term 1, she began, ticking a point off on her finger. 250 cal L gets transferred to my account right now, non-refundable. If you die, I keep it. If I die, I suppose you can try and get it back. Agreed.
Term 2. You don't ask questions. Not about the route, not about the people we might meet, not about what I have to do to get us through. You want a tour guide? Find someone else. You want to survive? You shut your mouth and listen. Understood. The muscles in his jaw ached. Term 3. You carry your own gear, plus whatever I give you. You don't touch anything. Not a wall, not a cable, not a single salt-rotted piece of scrap unless I clear it first. The fungus, it's not just growing on the city anymore. It is the city. He thought of the spores, of the face they had shown him. I know. Moro's gaze sharpened, catching the grim certainty in his tone. A flicker of curiosity, quickly suppressed. Last term, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly serious pitch. And this is the one you don't break. I say move, you move. I say run, you run. I say jump, you ask how high on the way down. I give an order, and you hesitate for half a second, I will leave you to the bloom. I will not die for a topsider's last wish. Am I clear? Joric met her gaze. He saw no room for negotiation, no mercy, only a brutal, pragmatic path to the place he needed to go. He was placing his life, his mission, his entire nihilistic worldview in this woman's calloused hands. You are, he said, his voice firm. He picked up his data slate and with a few taps initiated the transfer. A soft chime confirmed it. 250 calibrated liters of pure, clean water flowed into her account. Moro watched the confirmation, then drained her mug in one long swallow. She slammed it down on the table with a sharp crack. All right, Cantor, she said, standing up and grabbing her gear. Let's go get you killed. The service corridor ended not with a door, but with a scar. A jagged panel of rust-streaked plasteel had been pried from the wall, revealing a maw of absolute darkness behind it. Moro Cade grunted with the effort of sliding it aside, her wiry muscles taut under the stained fabric of her sumpsuit. The clean, ozonic air of the Aerie maintenance level, an atmosphere Joric had breathed his entire life without a second thought, was instantly violated. A draft sighed out from the shaft, carrying a scent he couldn't immediately place, something metallic and old, like a tomb of forgotten machines. "This is it?" Joric asked, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sterile quiet of the corridor. He kept his distance, his polished BCA-issue boots a stark contrast to the grime on the floor around the opening. "This is the throat," Moro corrected, without looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the darkness. "Swallows you from on high, spits you out in the guts. It's the only way down to the upper racks without a BCA checkpoint every 50 meters. She produced a heavy, jury-rigged winch remote from a pouch on her belt, its casing a patchwork of soldered wires and waterproof tape. "The BCA thinks this is it?" Joric asked, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sterile quiet of the corridor. He kept his distance, his polished BCA-issue boots a stark contrast to the grime on the floor around the opening. "This is the throat," Moro corrected without looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the darkness. "Swallows you from on high, spits you out in the guts. It's the only way down to the upper racks without a BCA checkpoint every 50 meters. She produced a heavy, jury-rigged winch remote from a pouch on her belt, its casing a patchwork of soldered wires and waterproof tape. The BCA thinks this shaft collapsed during the last tremor. Easier that way for everyone. She thumbed a switch, and from the depths came a tortured groan of protesting metal. A flickering orange light began to ascend, rising slowly through the blackness like a malevolent star. It illuminated a cage, a freight elevator that looked more like a relic scavenged from a pre-deluge scrapyard. Its mesh walls were warped and corroded, the floor a latticework of steel bars slick with a film of perpetual condensation. The cage shuddered to a halt level with the opening, its single emergency light casting long dancing shadows that made the corridor feel like a stage. Morrow yanked open the grating door. The shriek of metal on metal was a physical assault. "In you get, theologian," she said, her tone flat. "The whispering sickness doesn't wait for office hours." Joric hesitated. This wasn't an investigation anymore. It was a descent, a literal and metaphorical plunge from the world of quantifiable data and structured survivalism into this, an unlisted, unsanctioned portal to the city's festering underbelly. He thought of his sterile apartment in the Aerie, the silent hum of the air purifiers, the cool synthetic sheets on his bed. That world was a kilometer above him, but it already felt a lifetime away. He took a breath, the clean air a final, fleeting luxury, and stepped into the cage. The metal floor gave a sickening lurch under his weight. His own reflection stared back at him from a puddle of murky water on the floor, a pale, drawn face he barely recognized, the face of a man about to willingly submerge himself in filth to prove a point no one else cared about, that there was no God, only chemistry.
Morrow followed, pulling the grating shut. The finality of the sound, a heavy, resonant clang, echoed in the shaft. She engaged the winch, and with a jolt that sent Joric grabbing for the slimy wall, they began to fall. Falling was the only word for it. The descent was too fast, too uncontrolled. The clean, white polymer walls of the Aerie access tube blurred past the mesh for a few seconds before giving way to raw, weeping concrete. The sterile hum of the upper levels vanished, replaced by the howl of air rushing past and the rhythmic, agonizing screech of the brake calipers on the guide rail. Then came the smell. It hit him like a physical blow, a multi-layered assault that bypassed thought and went straight to the gag reflex. First, the deep, pervasive damp of wet concrete and rust. Underneath that, the acrid tang of mildew, so thick he could almost taste it on his tongue. And finally, something else, a sweet, cloying note, like honey and decay, like flowers blooming on a corpse, the scent of the murmuration, spore dust. He reflexively held his breath, a useless gesture. The air was a contaminated soup, and he was breathing it, filtering it through his lungs, letting it settle in the deepest parts of him. The sounds changed next. The shriek of the elevator was constant, but it was now joined by a chorus from the world they were sinking into. The city's true voice, a constant metronomic dripping, a complex symphony of 1,000 leaks. Drip, 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 plink. It was the sound of Benthos slowly bleeding to death. Beneath it all, a low-frequency hum began to build, a vibration that resonated in his bones, through the soles of his boots. The heartbeat. The colossal pumps circulating water through the city's arteries, a sound the pures in the Aerie never had to hear. "How far?" Joric managed, his voice tight.
Far enough, Morrow grunted, her knuckles white on the controls. You'll know.
He pressed his face closer to the mesh, trying to make sense of the darkness. Glimpses of a vertical world flashed by. A section of wall pulsed with a sickly green bioluminescence, the light revealing vast curtains of fungal growth clinging to pipes thick as his waist. He saw a makeshift catwalk, slick with slime, spanning a chasm of absolute black. For a second, a flicker of movement, a figure in rags staring out at them as they plunged past. Then gone. Distantly, he heard a shout, thin and reedy, followed by the sound of a baby crying. An impossible, heartbreaking sound in this mechanical abyss. This was a violation. His mind, the only sanctuary he had left, was being flooded. In the Aerie, every sensation was curated, filtered, controlled. Here, chaos reigned. The constant dampness was seeping through his clothes. The air was a physical weight, thick with moisture and contaminants. He felt a profound primal urge to be clean again, to stand under the harsh UV sterilizers of his home district until his skin burned. It was a useless, childish impulse. He was tainted now. He had crossed the threshold. His hand went to the rebreather unit on his belt, a standard-issue BCA device for hazardous zones. Morrow saw the movement. "Don't bother," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Spores this fine, that filter won't catch half of them. Besides, you walk out there wearing that, you're marking yourself as an off-worlder, a pure. You'll either get your throat cut for the hardware, or a mob of hymners will try to give you a blessing you won't walk away from." She looked at him, her eyes dark pits in the flickering orange light. "You want to find their God. You have to breathe its air." He let his hand drop. She was right. He couldn't be a clinician here. He had to be a part of the disease to study it. The thought was a cold knot in his stomach. The sweet, rotten smell seemed to intensify, as if the murmuration knew it was being discussed. He imagined the spores, microscopic and insidious, slipping past his body's defenses, looking for a home in his mind. He thought of the visions reported by the first-stage infected, the whispering sickness, ecstatic hallucinations, peace, unity. He saw for a fleeting moment his daughter's face, Anya, her bright, laughing eyes. The memory was so sharp, so painful, it felt like a new wound. He squeezed his eyes shut. "It's just a memory," he told himself. "Grief is a pathogen of the mind, nothing more." With a final, bone-jarring shudder and a deafening shriek of metal, the elevator slammed to a halt. The sudden stop threw him against the wall. For a moment, there was only the sound of their breathing and the ceaseless, maddening dripping from outside. Morrow wrestled with the gate, forcing it open with a groan. The Gill-Racks. It wasn't a level. It was an ecosystem. A dense, three-dimensional forest of rusted shipping containers and scavenged HAB units, all welded to the city's gargantuan support columns. Walkways and rope bridges crisscrossed dark chasms between structures. Everything was coated in a slimy, iridescent sheen, from the perpetual drizzle that fell from the unseen levels above. The only light came from strings of bare orange emergency bulbs and the eerie pulsing blue-green glow of fungal patches that grew in every crevice, casting the entire scene in the visual palette of a deep-sea trench. Joric stood frozen in the cage, a specimen in a jar, staring out at a world built from desperation and decay. The air was alive with noise, the murmur of 100 conversations in drip cant and pidgin dialects, the clang of a hammer on metal, the distant wail of a warning siren. It was overwhelming, suffocating, a living, breathing monument to failure. Mora was already on the narrow platform outside, her boots sure-footed on the slick grating. She turned back, her face half in shadow, half in the sickly green light. "Well?" she said, her voice impatient. "The clock's dripping, theologian." "Stay dry." He met her gaze. His apprehension had curdled into a cold, visceral dread. This place felt ancient, hungry. But his mission demanded he enter. His nihilism demanded he prove this world's God was just rot and damp. Clenching his jaw, Joric Cantor, the forensic theologian, took his first step out of the sterile cage and into the drowned cradle's humid heart. The gantry groaned under Joric's weight, a low metallic moan that vibrated up through the soles of his boots. Each step was a negotiation with rust and time. Below, a chasm of indeterminate depth fell away into black, unreflective water, its surface disturbed only by the lazy drift of glowing fungal spores, like inverted stars in a dead sky. The air, thick enough to chew, carried the murmuration's signature perfume, the cloying sweetness of rot and honey, layered over the ozone tang of failing machinery.
Moro was 10 paces ahead, a compact silhouette against the pulsing blue-green light of a vast mycelial curtain draped over a skeletal skyscraper a kilometer away. She moved with the fluid economy of a creature born to this vertical, decaying world, her feet finding purchase on the slick, corroded mesh as if by instinct. Lyra was strapped to her back, a small, sleeping bundle, the most precious and fragile thing in this entire drowned world. "Stay on the central beam," Moro called back, her voice tight, not bothering to turn. "Edges are friable. One wrong step and you're feeding the fish." Joric grunted an acknowledgement, his eyes scanning, analyzing, just as he'd been trained. The forensic theologian in him catalogued the strains on the support struts, the patterns of corrosion, the weak points. But another part of his mind, the part stained by the spores, was listening to a different kind of data. It was listening to the city's whispers, the low-frequency hum of the distant pumps, the heartbeat, and the phantom chorus that now lived permanently behind his eyes. He felt them with him, always. Annalise, a warm pressure at his side. Lyra, a fleeting tug on his hand. They were constructs of the fungus, he knew. Echoes imprinted on his dying gray matter. He had accepted this. He had even, in the hellish dark of the bloom deeps, begun to use them. Annalise's spectral intuition had guided him away from a patch of unstable flooring just yesterday. A tool, a symptom turned asset. He took another careful step, the metal screeching in protest. That's when he saw her. Not the ghost image, not the half-formed memory. Her. Lyra stood on the far side of the gantry, where it met the solid ferrocrete of the next platform. She wasn't glowing or translucent. She was solid. Real. She wore the little yellow raincoat he'd bought her for her 6th birthday, the one she was wearing the day the waters came. Her face, pale in the fungal glow, was turned towards him. Her expression wasn't sad or accusatory. It was just expectant. His heart seized. The analytical part of his brain screamed, "Pathogenic hallucination. Spore concentration is absolute down here. It's hijacking your visual cortex, accessing deep memory." But the father, the broken man who had survived when he shouldn't have, whispered back, "Look at her. She's perfect."
"Daddy?" The voice wasn't a memory. It was clear, cutting through the drip, drip, drip of condensation and the groan of the city. It was Lyra's voice. Morrow stopped, turning back to him, her face a mask of shadow and suspicion. "Joric, what is it?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. His world had narrowed to the 100-meter span of rusted metal and the small, impossible figure at the end of it. She wasn't looking at Morrow. She was looking only at him. She raised a small hand and beckoned, a simple, trusting gesture that shattered what was left of his clinical detachment. "It's not real. It is a lure. The fungus is learning. It's testing you." "Joric, talk to me!" Morrow's voice was sharper now, laced with alarm. He took a step, then another. He left the relative safety of the central support beam. His boots crunched on the weaker, flaking mesh near the edge. "It's okay," Lyra's voice floated to him, a melody over the abyss. "It's safe over here, with me." She took a step to her left, closer to a gaping hole in the gantry where the walkway and railing had long ago surrendered to gravity. She stood on the very precipice, her small rain boots inches from the fall. She smiled, and it was the same crooked, gentle smile that had owned his heart from the moment she was born. "It wants you to fall. It's a predator. This isn't guidance. This is an attack." But the spores sang a different hymn in his blood, a song of reunion, of peace, the end of the long, meaningless struggle. To step off this walkway wouldn't be a death. It would be a homecoming. "Lyra!" he breathed, the name a prayer and a curse on his lips. He was moving faster now, a trance-like shuffle toward the broken section, his eyes locked on her. "Joric, halt!" Morrow shouted, her voice echoing in the vast chamber. "That's an order, you salt-rotted pure! The railing is gone there!" He heard her, but the words were foreign, irrelevant, just noise. The only signal that mattered was the girl in the yellow raincoat, her hand still outstretched. He was 5 meters from the break. 4. 3. He saw Morrow move in his peripheral vision, a blur of motion. He felt a flicker of annoyance. She was ruining it. She couldn't see. She couldn't understand. "Joric, get back!" Then the world exploded into force and pain. Morrow hit him like a hydraulic piston, her shoulder driving into his ribs. The air blasted from his lungs. The vision of Lyra shattered into 1,000 motes of light. He and Morrow crashed onto the grating, a tangle of limbs and curses. And then came the sound, a high-pitched, tearing scream of tortured metal. The section of walkway he had been about to step onto, weakened by his proximity and the impact of their fall, gave way completely. The entire guardrail and a meter-wide chunk of mesh peeled away from the gantry and plunged into the darkness. It fell for a long, sickening time before a distant, muted splash echoed up from the depths. Silence descended, broken only by Joric's ragged gasps and the ever-present drip of water. Morrow pushed herself off him, her knee pinning his shoulder to the cold, wet grate. Her breath was hot and sharp with adrenaline against his ear. "Did you see it?" she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "Did you hear it? That was you! That was your brains getting dashed on some submerged pylon before the deep crawlers picked your bones clean!" Joric stared at the empty space where the walkway had been, where she had been. There was nothing there now but the void. The sweet, cloying scent of the murmuration felt like a gag in his throat. He started to tremble, a deep, uncontrollable shudder that began in his bones. The focused determination was gone. The insane, fleeting hope was gone. All that remained was a raw, animal terror, not of the fall, but of his own mind. She looked real, he stammered, the words tasting like ash. Morrow's grip on his shoulder tightened, her fingers digging in like claws. "I don't care if you saw the first founder himself serving synthale. Whatever is in your head is not your friend. It just tried to murder you, and if you follow it again, it'll take me and the kid down with you." She let him go, shoving him slightly. "Get up, slowly."
He pushed himself onto his hands and knees. His hands shook so badly he could barely support his own weight. He looked at them, flexing the fingers. These weren't his hands anymore. They belonged to the murmuration. His eyes, his ears, his memories, all compromised. All conduits for a will that was not his own.
He had thought he could use the infection, control it, a terrible symbiotic bargain. He was wrong. He was just a puppet, and his strings had almost been cut. Morrow stood over him, her scavenged pulse carbine held at a low ready. She wasn't looking at the path ahead anymore. She was looking at him. For the first time, Joric understood that she wasn't just his guide. She was his jailer, the only thing standing between him and the beautiful smiling ghost that waited for him in the deep. The perch was a rusted-out maintenance gantry, a skeleton of pre-deluge steel jutting from the weeping ferrocrete wall 4 levels above cistern beta 7. From here, the world was a study in decay, rendered in the World Bible's palette, the greasy blue glow of fungal veins pulsing in the chasm below, the sick green of algae slicks on pooled water, and the stark, buzzing orange of the single emergency strip light that failed to conquer the oppressive gloom. The air was thick enough to chew, a cocktail of ozone from a nearby transformer's death rattle, the pervasive damp, and something else, something new, a sweet, cloying scent like honeyed rot that coated the back of Joric's throat. He lay prone, the cold, gritty metal pressing into his chest, magnoculars fused to his eyes. Beside him, Morrow Cade was a shadow, her movements economical, her presence as quiet as the slow drip of condensation from the girder above them. Joric had prepared for chaos. The BCA's comms chatter, encrypted but for the panicked spikes in amplitude, had painted a picture of a full-scale riot. Cistern Beta 7, one of the last potable reserves in the Gamma 9 sector, had been declared a black zone. He expected to see the desperate clawing masses. He expected the crackle of shock malls and the screams of the thirsty. He expected the predictable, ugly math of human desperation. What he saw instead was silence. "Salt rot," Morrow breathed, the curse a soft puff of vapor in the humid air. "What am I looking at?" Joric didn't answer. He adjusted the focus on his magnoculars, the delicate whir of the mechanism loud in the unnatural quiet. His mind, a fortress built of clinical observation and catalogued pathology, struggled to categorize the data. Below, stretching from the cistern's main access portal and winding back into the cavernous darkness of the Gill-Racks, was a line of people, hundreds of them. Not a mob, not a scrum, a line, orderly, patient, silent. He scanned its length. The damps in their patched-up coveralls and slickers, the sump-tainted with the first telltale shimmer of fungal blooms on their skin, their eyes wide and placid. Children holding empty nutrient paste cans, the elderly leaning on scavenged pipes. No one pushed, no one shouted. They stood with a stillness Joric had only ever seen in corpses. "It's a pilgrimage," Joric murmured, the words tasting like heresy on his own tongue. His gaze followed the line to its source, the towering curved wall of the cistern itself, and there his scientific certainty began to fracture. The wall, usually a stained and weeping face of gray plasteel, was alive. Vast, pulsating curtains of mycelium, the color of bruised plums and deep-sea phosphorescence, draped its surface. They throbbed with a slow, gentle light, a rhythm that seemed to sync with the distant, low-frequency hum of the city's heartbeat.
and from these fungal sheets, something impossible was happening. Water, crystal clear water, was weeping from 1,000 porous nodules in the growth. It didn't gush or spray, it seeped, coalescing into heavy, perfect droplets that caught the bioluminescent glow before falling with a soft patter into the containers of the faithful. Joric zoomed in, his knuckles white on the magnoculars. A woman at the front of the line, her face gaunt with malnutrition, held a grimy fuel canister under one of the weeping nodules. The water that filled it was so pure it seemed to shine. She didn't gulp it down. She raised the canister with both hands, her head bowed for a long moment, before taking a slow, reverent sip. Then she stepped aside, making way for the next person, her expression not one of frantic relief, but of serene, profound gratitude. "This is a trick," his mind screamed, "a biological filtration system. The mycelial network is acting as a massive osmotic purifier, drawing water from the contaminated reservoir within and excreting it. It's an elegant survival mechanism for the organism, creating a dependent population to serve as vectors." He recited the clinical explanation to himself, a desperate mantra against the evidence of his own eyes. But the explanation felt hollow, an academic footnote to the sublime and terrifying spectacle below. "They're not just drinking, Joric," Morrow said, her voice tight with a tension he couldn't quite decipher. "Look, to the right."
He panned his magnoculars. A small boy, no older than his daughter had been, had stumbled, gashing his knee on the broken floor. His mother, instead of reaching for a precious med patch, simply scooped a handful of the glowing mycelium from the cistern wall. It came away like damp bread, and pressed the fungal poultice against the wound. Joric watched, transfixed, as the faint blue light of the fungus seemed to intensify where it touched the boy's skin. The boy didn't cry. He simply stared at the glow on his knee with wide, wondrous eyes.
He lowered the magnoculars, the immense, silent weight of the scene pressing down on him. The air no longer smelled just of rot, but of incense. The dripping water wasn't just a sound, it was a hymn. He was a scientist standing on the precipice of a new, terrifying religion, and his instruments were useless. His logic was failing. The pathogen wasn't just in the air and the water, it was in the silence between heartbeats, in the quiet reverence of a mother giving her child a drink of impossible water. His mission was to debunk this, to expose the fraud, to prove that this was nothing more than an insidious biological imperative dressed in the borrowed robes of divinity. But as he looked at the hundreds of faces below, faces etched with a peace he hadn't seen since before the world drowned, a single, devastating question took root in his soul. How do you cure a disease that feels like salvation? The air in BCA Central Command had no scent. It was an engineered nullity, scrubbed of ozone, of polymer, of human breath. It was the sterile vacuum in which Commander Kalen Rask felt most at home. He stood before the primary holo display, a wall of pre-deluge glass projecting an image of pure biological chaos. His reflection, a severe face bisected by the harsh line of his jaw, the white of his uniform a stark slash against the darkness, was superimposed over the scene, a ghost of order haunting a world of rot. On the screen the Gill-Racks festered. A drone's eye view of the Gamma-9 cistern showed a tide of humanity, a dense, swaying mass of damps packed shoulder to weeping shoulder. Their faces, upturned and ecstatic, were illuminated by a sickly green light emanating from the water itself. Through the drone's sensitive microphone, their song bled into the silent command center, a low, resonant hum that was almost beautiful, a chord of unified hope that grated against Kalen's teeth like grinding rust. He watched them scoop the glowing water into their mouths with cupped, grimy hands. He saw them weeping, embracing, falling to their knees in what they undoubtedly thought was religious fervor. Cantor would see theology here, a new god performing its first great trick. Kalen saw only a pathogen deploying a resource-based incentive to accelerate its replication cycle. He tapped a control panel at his side. A mesh of data overlays shimmered into existence over the drone feed. Red particles, representing airborne spore density, swirled in a vortex centered on the cistern. The concentration was 1,000 times above acceptable limits. A predictive model traced vectors of infection, spreading outwards in blooming, cancerous fractals, overwhelming the adjacent sectors within 48 hours. It was efficient. He had to grant the organism that. It had identified the population's primary existential stressor, water purity, and addressed it. It offered a solution the BCA could not. A brilliant, terrifying piece of evolutionary warfare. He watched a mother press a bottle of the glowing liquid to her child's lips. The child drank greedily. A miracle. No. A bioweapon of unparalleled elegance. He felt no anger, no disgust. He felt the cold, clear certainty of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal gangrene. The limb had to be amputated immediately. His finger pressed a single glowing rune on the console. His voice was flat, devoid of inflection, a sound as sterile as the air he breathed. Squad leaders, TAC-COM, now. He didn't turn. He kept his eyes locked on the screen, memorizing the layout, the choke points, the structural weaknesses of the plaza. The singing from the drone feed was beginning to irritate him, a discordant note in a symphony of cold logic. 3 figures entered the room, their magnetic-soled boots clicking in perfect unison on the polished polymer floor. Captain Eva Rostova, Lieutenant Jax Kellerman, and the younger Captain Fenrin. They snapped to attention behind him, their posture as rigid as the city's support columns. "Commander," Rostova said, her voice a clipped report. Kalen gestured to the screen without looking at them. "Report, Captain Fenrin. What do you see?" The young captain leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "Sir, a mass gathering, unsanctioned worship. Looks like the source of the Gamma-9 outbreak, the one Cantor was sent to." "Wrong," Kalen cut him off. The word was a blade. "You see a Class 4 biohazard at peak infectivity. You see a centralized dispersal node for a pathogenic organism. You are not sociologists, captains. You are sanitation engineers." He brought up a tactical map of the sector, the area around the cistern glowing a bloody crimson. "Operation Purity Sweep is authorized. Your objective is not containment. It is not quarantine. It is sterilization." Silence descended, thick and absolute, broken only by the faint, maddening hum from the drone feed. Jax cleared his throat. "Sir, sterilization protocols." "Thermic charges and incinerator units," Kalen said, his eyes still fixed on the map. "I want every square meter of that plaza, including the sublevels and ventilation shafts, brought to a temperature of 1,000 degrees Celsius. I want every organic particle turned to carbon. Leave nothing but ash." It was Fenrin who flinched, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. "Commander, there are hundreds of civilians in that zone. Women, children, unarmed." Kalen finally turned, his gaze as cold and unforgiving as the abyss between the city tiers. He pinned the young captain in place with it. They are no longer civilians, Captain. They are hosts. Their bodies are factories for the spores that will choke this city to death. Every breath they take releases more of the contagion into our filtration systems. They are the ammunition in a gun pointed at the heart of Benthos. He took a step closer, his voice dropping, becoming almost conversational, which was somehow more menacing. Tell me, Fenrin, when a limb is infected, rotten to the bone, threatening the life of the patient, do you bandage it? Do you pray over it? Or do you take up the scalpel and cut it off to save the body? Fenrin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His gaze flickered back to the screen, to the mother and her child, now swaying together with the crowd, their eyes closed in bliss. He looked back at Kalen, his face hardening into a mask of resolve. "You cut it off, sir." "You cut it off," Kalen affirmed, his voice returning to its robotic command tone. "The individuals in that plaza are now classified as acceptable losses in the preservation of Benthos. You have your targets, you have your orders. Execute." "Sir," they chorused, a single sharp sound. They saluted, turned with military precision, and marched out of the TACCOM. The door slid shut behind them with a soft hiss of compressed air, sealing Kalen back in his sterile silence.
He stood for a moment longer, watching the feed. The hymn swelled, a final defiant act of faith against the coming fire. He felt nothing. The problem had been identified. The solution had been deployed. The outcome was a simple matter of logistics. He zoomed the drone's camera in, sweeping across the faces, cataloging them as data points. His eyes caught a flicker of movement at the edge of the crowd. A familiar figure, gaunt, haunted. Joric Cantor, standing half in the shadows, staring at the miracle with an expression Kalen couldn't decipher. Interesting. Another variable, but not one that would change the equation. Kalen turned his back on the screen, on the singing, on the hundreds of souls he had just condemned to fire. He walked to another terminal, the surface glowing with schematics for the city's primary water reclamation pumps. The purity sweep was already a completed task in his mind. Now there were other systems that required his attention, other signs of decay that needed to be monitored, managed, and, when the time came, excised. The overflow pipe was a throat clogged with 80 years of filth. Joric pressed his face against the cold, weeping metal to let Morrow squeeze past him, her movements a study in fluid silence. The air tasted of rust and stagnant water, a familiar Benthos perfume, but here it was thick enough to chew. Ahead, a rusted grill blocked their path, submerged in a foot of viscous, algae-slicked runoff. Through the gaps, a sound bled into their claustrophobic world, a low, resonant hum, like 1,000 voices trying to find a single note. "This is it," Morrow breathed, her voice barely a disturbance in the oppressive air. "Cistern Beta 7, the source of the miracle." Her use of the word was drenched in a diver's pragmatism, the verbal equivalent of scare quotes. Joric did not reply. He was listening to the hum. It wasn't just sound, it was a pressure in his sinuses, a vibration in the fillings of his teeth. It felt ancient and alive. For a professional debunker, it was the overture to a very familiar opera of delusion.
"Grill is loose. BCA cut it for a sweep years ago and never sealed it proper. Lucky for us."
Morrow worked a pry bar into the rusted frame. It groaned, a deep, sickening sound that seemed impossibly loud against the humming backdrop. Joric froze, every muscle tensed, listening for any change in the sound from beyond, any sign they'd been heard. The humming continued, oblivious, indifferent. With a final metallic sigh, a section of the grill gave way, sinking into the muck with a soft glug.
Your show, theologian. Stay low, stay quiet. We get a look, we get a sample, we get out. Don't touch anything you don't have to.
Joric nodded, his own breath held tight in his chest. He followed her through the gap, the foul water soaking the knees of his trousers. He emerged from the pipe's maw into a space so vast it stole the air from his lungs. They were on a maintenance catwalk, a skeleton of corroded iron clinging to the curved wall of the cistern. Below, where a reservoir of the city's lifeblood should have been, there was only a shallow pool reflecting a light that had no business being here. The entire far wall of the colossal chamber was gone. In its place was it, the source, the weeping wall. It wasn't a wall so much as a living glacier of fungal matter, a pulsating, impossibly huge curtain of mycelium that had devoured the ferrocrete. It stretched from the sludge-covered floor to the vaulted, unseen ceiling hundreds of feet above, a tapestry woven in greasy blues and the green of terminal sickness. Veins of brighter, almost white light pulsed within its translucent depths in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, like a sleeping leviathan's heartbeat. Clear, clean water, impossibly clean water, wept from a million porous openings in its surface, trickling down the fungal face in shimmering rivulets that fed the pool below. The air, thick with the scent of ozone and wet decay, was pierced by an undertone that was both cloying and divine, honey and fresh soil, rot and blossoming lilies.
And at its base, scattered like debris, were the faithful, dozens of hymners, their faces upturned, bathed in the fungal glow. They weren't shouting or preaching. They were silent, swaying gently, their bodies slack with rapture. The deep, resonant hum Joric had heard in the pipe was coming from them, or rather, through them. They were conduits, human tuning forks braiding with the wall's silent song. Stealthy tension curdled into something else in Joric's gut. Awe, a cold, intellectual, and utterly terrifying awe. "It's salt rot," Moreau hissed beside him, her awe entirely of the pragmatic, danger-assessing kind. "There's more of them than the whispers said." She tugged on his sleeve. "Joric, we need to find cover. That access ladder across the way. We can get a better vantage." "Joric?" He didn't hear her. He was no longer a fugitive in a hostile place. He was a scientist presented with the specimen of a lifetime. His fear, the constant grinding companion of his life in Benthos, had been neatly excised and replaced with a scalpel-sharp, obsessive curiosity. This was magnificent, a biological engine of unparalleled scale and efficiency. It was hijacking municipal infrastructure, performing atmospheric and liquid phase filtration on a massive scale, and it had somehow induced a docile, shared psychological state in its hosts. It wasn't a god, it was a masterpiece of pathogenic evolution. "What are you doing?" Moreau's voice was sharp, a needle pricking the balloon of his focus. He had already unslung his pack. His hands, moving with an unconscious precision, laid out the sterile contents of his sampling kit on the grated floor.
a microscalpel, polymer collection vials, a portable spectrometer, the tools of his trade, the weapons of his faithlessness.
Joric, put that away! Are you insane? They'll see us!
They won't, he murmured, his eyes distant, his eyes never leaving the wall.
Look at them! Total sensory dissociation,
Classic symptom of advanced Class 3 hallucinogenics integration. They're not in this room anymore, Moreau. He picked up the scalpel and a vial. He had to get closer. He had to get a core sample. The thought was not a plan, it was a compulsion, an itch deep in his cerebral cortex. This was the enemy, not the entranced Heim nurse, not even Silas, this beautiful, terrible biological engine. And to defeat it, to prove it was just matter and chemistry, he had to dissect it. He moved, stepping off the catwalk onto a wide, curving maintenance ledge that ran along the cistern's edge. It offered a direct, if terrifyingly exposed, path towards the wall's base. Joric, no, get back here! Salt rot man, get back here now! Moreau's plea was a ghost on the wind. The humming from the Heimners seemed to swell, wrapping around him. But it was just auditory pareidolia, his mind seeking patterns in the chaos. He kept his eyes locked on a section of the wall where the blue light seemed to pulse brightest. His own heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic animal rhythm against the wall's slow, divine thrum. He reached the edge of the fungal growth. It wasn't just growing on the concrete, it had fused with it. The texture was smooth, cool, and strangely pliant under his gloved fingers, like chilled flesh. The sweet smell was overwhelming here, an anesthetic that seemed to dull the edges of his fear. He brought the scalpel up. The Heimners swayed, the light pulsed, the city groaned around them. With a surgeon's care, he pressed the blade into the living mass. There was no resistance, no tearing. It parted like thick jelly. A droplet of clear, viscous fluid welled up around the incision, glowing with its own internal light. He held the vial to it, letting the substance run inside. Another drop, and another. He worked with a feverish intensity, his entire universe shrinking to this single point of contact, this act of violation and discovery. He was sealing the vial when he felt it. A vibration. Not through the floor or in the air, but up through the scalpel into his hand, a tremor that ran up his arm and settled deep in his chest. It wasn't a physical shock. It was a note of recognition, a fleeting, impossible sense of being observed not by the Heimners, but by the wall itself. The humming of the choir rose in pitch, a subtle shift from mindless reverence to a query. Joric pulled back, his clinical detachment shattering like pre-deluge glass. He looked down at the glowing vial in his hand, and for an instant the light within it coalesced. It formed a shape, a tiny, perfect image of his daughter's eye, wide and blue and full of impossible questions, before dissolving back into a formless, sickly glow. A gasp escaped his lips, loud in the sudden stillness of his own mind. Before he could process the hallucination, Moreau was there, her hand clamped onto his arm like a vice, her face pale in the blue light. Moreau's head shifted, her voice cutting through the humid air. "Odd good or odd bad, Theo? I'm not a fan of surprises down here." "Neither," Joric said, not looking up. His focus was absolute. "The water. Right here, where the filaments are thickest, the particulate count is near 0. Toxin levels are negligible." He ran a secondary spectrographic analysis. The results confirmed it. "It's cleaner than Aerie-grade reclamation water. Salt rot. It's cleaner than anything the kidney can produce." "So the spore heads are right," Moreau scoffed. "It's a miracle.
Of course, Joric countered, his tone dripping with the acid of long-practiced cynicism. A miracle of osmotic filtration and enzymatic degradation. It's a biological process, Morrow, nothing more. A lucky mutation. Yet a knot of unease tightened in his gut. The efficiency was unnatural, too perfect. The energy expenditure required for this level of purification should be immense, but the organism showed no signs of metabolic stress. It was doing the impossible, effortlessly. He retracted the sample plate and recalibrated the scanner, shifting its function from biology to structural analysis. His hypothesis was simple, proven time and again. Wherever the murmuration took root, it weakened its host structure. It leached minerals, its rhizoids burrowing into microfractures, accelerating the inevitable decay. He aimed the emitter at the colossal support beam next to him, a pillar of rust-streaked, weeping concrete, and exposed rebar where the mycelial lattice was thickest. He initiated the scan. A wireframe model of the beam appeared on his screen, overlaid with a color-coded stress map. Blue for stable, green for moderate stress, yellow for critical, red for imminent failure. Joric stared. The beam was almost entirely blue. Impossible. This whole sector was a catastrophe of failing infrastructure. Cistern Beta 7 had been flagged for decommissioning 20 years ago. The reports he had studied showed critical stress fractures across every primary support in this chamber. The beam he was scanning should be a furious Christmas tree of yellow and red. He thumped the side of the scanner with the heel of his hand. Piece of junk.
He ran the diagnostic again. The device whirred, its sensors bathing the pillar in imperceptible frequencies. The result was identical. Solid, stable blue with a few pockets of green. He saw a flicker of red, but it was deep inside the pillar, far from the surface. "What is it?" Morrow asked, her voice closer now. She had moved to his shoulder, peering at the screen. "A sensor glitch," Joric snapped, his frustration mounting. "This thing's been submerged one too many times. The readings are garbage." But his own words felt hollow. The scanner was old world, military grade. It didn't just glitch. He killed the power to his headlamp, plunging them into the sickly, pulsing bioluminescence of the chamber. He needed to see it with his own eyes. He crawled to the edge of the catwalk, his face inches from the junction where the glowing fungus met the decaying concrete. He had expected to see the usual pattern of parasitic intrusion, a chaotic, cancerous spread. But this was different. This was order. The mycelial threads didn't just cling to the surface, they were woven into it. They had grown into the existing cracks, not to widen them, but to fill them. Where chunks of ferrocrete had sloughed away, the fungus had spun intricate web-like structures that followed the lines of the missing rebar, forming a kind of biological composite. It wasn't a random growth. It was a lattice, a geodesic framework, intricate as a spider's web, but with the clear, purposeful geometry of a stress diagram. His breath caught in his throat. The sweet smell of the fungus suddenly felt suffocating. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm against the cistern's slow, steady drip. No, it's pareidolia. The mind seeking patterns in chaos. It has to be. With a trembling hand, he activated the scanner one last time. He switched it to its widest, most power-intensive setting, a full-spectrum resonance scan that would map the entire mycelial network within the cistern, treating it as a single contiguous object. The device hummed loudly, the screen flickering as a three-dimensional model of the vast chamber began to resolve. Lines of light, the fungal network, spread across the wireframe walls and supports. At first it looked like a mess, a chaotic scribble.
Then the analytical software kicked in, tracing load-bearing pathways, highlighting tensile strength and compression points. The chaotic scribble resolved into a design, a blueprint. Joric felt a wave of vertigo so profound he had to grip the railing to keep from falling. The fungus wasn't just patching a few cracks in one beam. The scan showed the entire network was a single, integrated architectural system. It was reinforcing every major structural flaw in the cistern. Where a support pillar was buckling under compressive load, the lattice was woven into dense, columnar bundles. Where a ceiling section was suffering from tensile stress, the filaments were spread into broad, supportive fans, like the flying buttresses of some impossible cathedral. It knew. Somehow, this slime knew civil engineering. It had analyzed the failing structure and was actively, intelligently counteracting the decay. It wasn't a pathogen feeding on a corpse. It was a surgeon, propping up a dying body, holding it together with sinews of living light. The foundation of Joric's world, a universe built on the bedrock of random, pitiless chaos, cracked. The data on his screen was not an opinion. It was not a faith. It was a measurement. And it screamed of intent, of purpose, of a mind so vast and alien it could use a dying city as its building material. Morrow placed a hand on his shoulder. He flinched at the contact. "Joric? Salt rot, you're white as a sumpworm. What did you find?" He couldn't tear his eyes from the impossible blueprint glowing on his wrist. He tried to speak, but his throat was tight with a terror far deeper than any fear of physical danger. It was the terror of a man who has spent his life proclaiming the throne of heaven is empty, only to find something unimaginably vast sitting upon it. He finally managed to whisper, the words ragged and broken. "It's not eating the city. It's holding it up." The world had compressed to the greasy glass of the scanner screen. Nothing else existed. Not the oppressive tomb-like curve of cistern Beta 7's rust-weeping walls, nor the metronomic drip of condensation that measured out the city's slow death. Not even Morrow, a tense silhouette of coiled wire and impatience just at the edge of his vision. There was only the data, a river of sickly green light flowing across the dark display.
He was watching a miracle. Not Silas's kind of miracle, the flesh and fungus type that stank of honey and rot. This was a miracle of pure information. For weeks he'd tracked the murmuration signal as a chaotic, organic waveform, a biological broadcast as unpredictable and wild as a fever dream. It swelled and receded, its patterns like the breathing of some vast submerged lung. But now there was something else inside it, a parasite. A thin, razor-straight line of code cut through the murmuration's gentle curves. It was clean, precise, and utterly artificial. A repeating signature packet, flashing with a periodicity so regular it made his teeth ache. He leaned closer, the ozone tang of the overworked device stinging his nostrils. He knew that signature. He'd seen it in sterile Aerie briefing rooms, on the data slates of BCA enforcers. It was Kalen Rask's command encryption. It wasn't just nearby. It was inside the signal, using it, piggybacking on the fungal network like a tick on a leviathan. They weren't hunting him with scanners and patrols. They were tracking him through the very infection he was supposed to be dismantling. The thought was so violating, so fundamentally impossible, that his brain refused to process it. every spore he inhaled, every shimmer of bioluminescence he'd followed, every ghostly whisper from his dead daughter, it had all been leading them right to him, a breadcrumb trail of his own damnation. He felt a sudden, profound coldness that had nothing to do with the cistern's damp chill. His clinical detachment, the last armor plating around his soul, simply cracked and fell away. He wasn't the investigator. He was the specimen. That's when the sound began. At first it was just another layer in the city's groaning symphony. A high, thin note beneath the bass thrum of the distant reclamation pumps, so faint he almost dismissed it as tinnitus from the pressure. But it didn't fade. It held. A pure, unwavering tone that scraped at the edge of hearing. Morrow heard it too. He didn't see her move, but he felt the shift in the air beside him, the subtle tension of a predator scenting danger. "Joric," she said, her voice a low growl. "What is that?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. He was still staring at the impossible line of code on his scanner, watching it pulse. Here, here, here. A digital heartbeat counting down to his execution.
The sound grew. It separated itself from the ambient noise of Benthos, peeling away from the groans of stressed metal and the slosh of water. It became a siren. ABC cap, purity sweep alert. Distant, but gaining altitude, gaining proximity. Unmistakable. Outside the narrow, corroded entrance to the cistern, the communal hum of the hymners faltered. Their low, resonant chorus, a sound that had been a constant, blissful backdrop for the past hour, wavered like a dying light. Confusion was bleeding into their reverence. "Joric!" Morrow's voice was sharper now, cutting through his paralysis. Her hand clamped down on his shoulder, her calloused fingers digging into the thin fabric of his jacket. "That's a top-level alert. That's not a drill. We've been made." He finally tore his eyes from the screen. The encrypted signal continued its placid, malevolent blink. A Trojan horse in the ghost of God. "He's been listening," Joric whispered, the words feeling alien in his own mouth. "The whole time, he's been listening." "What? Who has been listening? Salt rot, Joric, snap out of it!" The siren was louder now, echoing down the vast vertical shafts of the Gill-Racks, bouncing off a million weeping surfaces until it seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. It was a physical presence, a pressure wave that vibrated in his bones. The steady drip, drip, drip from the cistern ceiling seemed to accelerate, a frantic, panicked rhythm against the rising shriek. Morrow shook him, a hard, violent rattle that made his teeth click together. "The sweepers! It's Kalen's butchers! They don't take prisoners, you know that! They sterilize!" She didn't have to elaborate. He'd seen the aftermath. The clean, white-hot scorch marks on the walls, the faint smell of incinerated protein. The harmonious chant of the hymners outside had completely disintegrated. It was replaced by a nervous, discordant murmur, punctuated by sharp, fearful questions. The sweet, cloying scent of fungal blossoms was now undercut by the sour tang of sweat. Their shared trance was broken, their beautiful lie shattered by an ugly truth with a siren. "We have to go, now, through the old sump access. It'll be flooded, but it's our only chance." Morrow was already pulling at him, her survival instincts overriding everything else. She was a creature of the damps, and that sound was her apocalypse.
But Joric remained frozen, his boots feeling as if they were welded to the grated floor. It wasn't just the fear of Kalen, it was the sheer, mind-breaking totality of the revelation. His quest for a scientific truth had been a farce. He'd been a rat in a maze, and the architects had just sounded the bell for the final experiment. His greatest fear,
that his own mind was no longer his own, was dwarfed by a new one, that his enemy understood his compromised mind better than he did. The siren crested, becoming a deafening, piercing scream that seemed to tear the very air apart. Outside, the murmuring of the crowd erupted into outright panic. Shouts, the clang of someone dropping something metal, the beginning of a stampede. Morrow let out a string of curses, her voice raw with desperation. She ripped the scanner from his unresisting grip and slammed it against the wall. The screen fractured into a spider web of dead pixels, the green light winking out forever. The ghost in the machine was gone. "There!" she yelled over the din, her face inches from his, her eyes wide with a fear he was only just beginning to feel. "It's gone. Whatever it was, it doesn't matter. Living matters. Lyra matters. Move, Joric, move!" Her words finally found purchase. Lyra. The name was a key unlocking his frozen limbs. The dawning shock gave way, collapsing into a landslide of pure animal terror. The abstract horror on the screen was nothing compared to the concrete, shrieking reality of imminent, violent death. The siren wailed, a promise of fire and sanitized oblivion. Morrow was right. Nothing else mattered. He stumbled, catching himself on her arm, and let her drag him away from the entrance, deeper into the cistern's stinking, dripping darkness, just as the first beams of BCA searchlights sliced through the humid air outside. The air in the plaza still tasted of miracle, a strange, impossible hybrid of pure, cold water and the sweet, cloying scent of mycelial bloom, like honey and rot made holy. Hundreds of damps crowded the space before Cistern Beta 7, their faces upturned, lit by the greasy orange of emergency floods and the faint pulsing green of the fungal veins that had rewritten the cistern's weeping face. They touched the water trickling from the purified overflow, a stream so clean it looked like a black void in the murky light. They cupped it in their hands, weeping. They sang a low, dissonant hymn that was more breath than sound, a chorus of fragile hope in a concrete tomb. From the cover of a rusted maintenance kiosk, Joric watched them, a pressure gauge in his hand forgotten. His own throat was dry. Salt rot. It was mass hysteria, a pathogen-induced delusion. The fungus had somehow bypassed the cistern's primary filtration, its enzymes breaking down the heavy metals and saline content. A biological anomaly. Not a god, not a miracle. And yet the hope on their faces was real. It was a tangible force, something he could almost feel on his skin, an electrostatic charge of raw, desperate belief. "We have our readings, Cantor." Morrow's voice was a low growl beside him, her eyes scanning the plaza's access tunnels, not the crowd. "Time to fade before the BCA notices this little prayer meeting." Joric didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on a young woman dipping a strip of cloth into the clean water, then tenderly washing the face of a small child whose skin bore the scaly lesions of some taint. The act was so gentle, so reverent, it felt like a violation to witness it. This is how it spreads, he told himself, the litany of a debunker. Not just through spores, but through moments like this. Hope is the most dangerous pathogen. Then a new sound. Not the metronomic drip of condensation or the groan of the superstructures. It was a low, uniform hum, a frequency that vibrated deep in the bones, climbing the scale from subsonic to a piercing thrum. The crowd's hymn faltered. Heads turned. The hopeful faces tightened with a more familiar expression, fear. Without warning, the plaza was bleached of all color.
Harsh, sterile white light flooded the space from 4 massive archways, pinning every person in a merciless glare. Silhouetted against the light were figures, tall, broad, insect-like in their matte black armor. BCA purity squads. They moved with the cold, synchronized purpose of machinery.
By order of the Benthos Consolidation Authority, a voice boomed from hidden loudspeakers, amplified to a painful degree. This sector is under purity protocol. All uncleared personnel are designated as biological threats. Sterilization will commence.
Salt rot, Morrow breathed, grabbing Joric's arm and yanking him down behind the kiosk. Move, now! The first wave wasn't light or bullets. It was sound. A dissonant chord erupted from emitters mounted on the squad's shoulders, a physical wave of sonic pressure that slammed into the plaza. Joric felt it in his teeth first, a high-frequency vibration that seemed to liquefy his skull. The world warped, the air grew thick as water, and the screams of the crowd became a distorted, underwater warble. He pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound wasn't just heard, it was felt, an invasive violation of his entire being. Beside him, Morrow was already stuffing scraps of insulated wiring into her ears, her face a mask of grim experience. She was mouthing words at him, but all he could hear was the city-killing drone. He saw the crowd collapse like puppets with their strings cut. They writhed on the grimy plasteel, clutching their heads, vomiting a thin, algae-paced gruel. The hopeful hymns were replaced by raw, involuntary shrieks of pure agony. Then, as quickly as it began, the sonic assault stopped. A ringing silence descended, punctuated by moans and the spatter of rain from the levels above. Thick gouts of orange flame roared into the plaza, impossibly bright and hot in the perpetual damp. They weren't shooting at anyone in particular. They were simply cleansing. The fire washed over the incapacitated bodies, indiscriminate and absolute. The wet concrete hissed and steamed. The bioluminescent mycelium on the cistern wall blackened and curled into ash. The sacred, purified water evaporated in a furious cloud. A man tried to stand, his clothes already alight, and his scream was cut short as a second stream of fire consumed his head. The woman Joric had been watching was on the ground, her body a shield over her child. The fire took her without pause. For a horrifying, eternal second, her body was a burning silhouette, an effigy of maternal love, before collapsing into a smoldering heap. The child was gone. The smell hit him next, a vile cocktail of ozone, jellied promethium, and cooking meat. It filled his lungs, coated his tongue. He retched, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't a purge, it was an extermination. This was Gill-Racks' structured survivalism in its purest form, the ruthless mathematical excision of a variable, a disease, a belief. Joric's mind flashed with an image, a spore-induced phantom so vivid it eclipsed the horror before him. His own daughter, Lyra, looking at him, her small face streaked with ash, her eyes wide with a question he could never answer. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the afterimage was burned onto his retinas.
Joric.
Morrow's voice was sharp, cutting through the fog. She shook his shoulder hard. They're clearing quadrant by quadrant. We have one chance. That utility conduit, see it? He opened his eyes. The world swam back into focus. The burning plaza, the methodical advance of the armored figures, their flamethrowers painting arcs of death across the stone.
Morrow was pointing to a narrow, darkened opening in the wall 20 meters away, partially hidden by a collapsed bulkhead. His body felt disconnected, his limbs made of lead. He watched a squad member turn a body over with his boot, then douse it again with a short, efficient burst of flame. No malice, no rage, just the cold, blank execution of a task. "They're not just killing them," Joric heard himself say, his voice a raw whisper. "They're erasing them. They're burning the idea."
"And they'll burn us next if we don't move," Morrow hissed, her face inches from his. Her eyes were hard, pragmatic, but he saw a flicker of the same horror in them that he felt consuming him. "On my mark. Stay low. Don't look back." He nodded, the motion jerky, robotic. He could feel the heat on his face now as the flames crept closer. The hymn was gone. The hope was gone. The miracle had become a pyre. Morrow tensed. Now! He didn't want to run. He wanted to stand up. He wanted to scream at the faceless monsters, at Kalen, at the broken, meaningless world that allowed this. But survival was a deeper, more primal instinct. He pushed off the ground, his body low, and ran, the roar of the flames and the ghosts of his past chasing him into the dark. The distant crackle wasn't static from a failing conduit. It was gunfire. Joric knew the sound, the dry, percussive pop of a BCA pulse rifle, distinct from the jury-rigged slug throwers common in the Gill-Racks, a sound of sterile, systematic violence. "This way," Morrow hissed, her voice a tight coil of tension. She yanked his arm, pulling him from the main cistern gallery into a narrower maintenance corridor. "The BT7 access ducts should lead us back toward the sump drains. They won't follow us that deep." The air here was thicker, tasting of rust and old water. Emergency lighting cast long orange shadows that danced with the perpetual drip, drip, drip from corroded pipes overhead. The sound of the city's heartbeat, the low-frequency thrum of the reclamation pumps, was a physical pressure against his sternum. But even that deep, resonant hum was being shredded by the rising symphony of slaughter. The pops were closer now, punctuated by screams that were thin and sharp as needles. "They're not just clearing the cistern," Joric said, his voice flat, analytical, a detached observation to keep the fear at bay. "This isn't a purity sweep. This is a purge." Morrow shot him a look, her face slick with grime and condensation in the sickly light. "What's the difference, theologian? Dead is dead." She didn't wait for an answer, her wiry frame moving with a scavenger's economy of motion, her boots finding sure footing on the slick, grated floor.
He followed, his own movements feeling clumsy, academic. His world was data, spore counts, doctrinal analysis. Her world was this, the groaning, weeping guts of Benthos. The sounds of violence were growing louder, echoing down the metallic throat of the corridor, not just from behind him, but from ahead as well. A pincer, Kalen's signature strategy, efficient, brutal, predictable. "Salt rot," Morrow grieved, stopping so abruptly Joric nearly collided with her. She held a hand up, her head cocked. The distant cacophony was resolving into individual sounds. The rhythmic stomp of armored boots, a high, keening wail cut brutally short, and something new, a liquid, hungry roar that evaporated the moisture from the air and raised the hair on Joric's arms. "Flamethrower," he identified, the clinical term tasting like ash in his mouth. He'd seen the aftermath in cult compounds before. Fused bodies, shadow stains on concrete, an unsubtle tool for an unsubtle regime. "They're flushing them out," Morrow whispered, her eyes wide. "Flushing them towards us."
The thought had barely formed when the corridor ahead erupted. It wasn't a stampede, not at first. It was a single, terrified man, his face a mask of disbelief, his clothes torn. He stumbled through the junction 50 meters ahead, looked back, and his face dissolved into pure animal terror. He opened his mouth to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the dozens, then hundreds who poured into the corridor behind him. A human wave, a tide of flesh and fear. "Move!" Morrow yelled, grabbing his jacket. "Joric, back, now!" But there was nowhere to go. The corridor behind them was a dead end, sealed by a pressure door that hadn't turned in 50 years. They flattened themselves against the weeping wall, the cold, slimy concrete pressing against Joric's back. He tried to analyze the flow, the physics of the panicked mob. A fluid dynamic problem, that's all it was, a problem to be solved.
Then the first body slammed into him, and all analysis ceased. The force was stunning, a blunt force trauma that drove the air from his lungs. The man's eyes were white with terror, his breath a hot, foul gust of algae paste and panic. He was just a shape, a vector of force, and then he was gone, swallowed by the press. The wave hit them full on, a crushing, suffocating mass. Joric's world shrank to the smell of unwashed bodies, the slickness of sweat-drenched fabric, the cacophony of shrieks and desperate prayers. "Morrow!" he yelled, his hand locked around her wrist. Her bones felt as fragile as a bird's under his grip. "Don't let go!" she screamed back, her voice already sounding distant. The current was too strong. It wasn't a collection of people anymore. It was a single entity, a mindless organism of pure flight instinct. Joric's feet slipped on the grated floor. Someone's elbow caught him in the ribs, a sharp, blinding pain. He saw Morrow's face for a split second, her expression one of grim determination, and then a larger body, a dock worker by the size of him, surged between them. Her hand was ripped from his. "Morrow!" His shout was a meaningless sound, instantly devoured by the greater noise. He was adrift, tossed and turned in the torrent. He braced his feet, trying to fight his way to the side, but it was like trying to swim up a waterfall. He saw faces in the crush, a young woman with fungal luminescence tracing patterns on her cheek, a hymner, her mouth open in a silent hymn of terror. An old man, his eyes vacant, simply letting the tide carry him. For a horrifying, lucid second, one of the faces resolved into his daughter's. Young, terrified, lost in a crowd, her hand outstretched. An old memory, a deep wound torn open and salted by the present horror. The hallucination, or memory, or whatever it was, broke him. His strength fled. The image of losing her again, right here in this stinking tube of metal and death, was a physical blow. He was slammed back against the wall, the ridged edge of a control panel digging into his spine. The tide flowed past him, a river of desperation. He was pinned, trapped.
The sounds from the direction of the cistern were now terrifyingly close. The crisp crack, crack, crack of pulse rifle fire was no longer an echo, but a sharp, immediate threat. He could hear the barked orders of a BCA squad leader, the voice distorted by a helmet speaker. "Advance! Sterilize on contact! No quarter!" Then came the roar. The whoosh of the flamethrower was a physical presence, a wave of heat that traveled down the corridor and washed over him. The screaming of the crowd pitched higher, turning from fear into pure agony. A new smell joined the ozone and the damp, the sweet, sickening stench of cooking meat, of burning hair. Joric craned his neck, his cheek pressed to the cold, wet metal. He could see the end of the corridor now where the mob was thinnest. A stark white light cut through the gloom, the headlamp of a BCA enforcer's helmet, then another and another, a line of them, advancing shoulder to shoulder, their black armor impervious, their faceplates reflecting the orange glow of the flames. They were monsters from the ideology of structured survivalism, faceless, remorseless angels of order.
The man in the center raised his weapon. The pilot light flickered. The people at the back of the mob, the ones closest to the death squad, tried to turn back, but there was no room. They clawed at the backs of those in front of them, their faces a canvas of ultimate despair. They were being crushed between the stampede and the fire, and Joric was caught in the middle. He was a rock in the stream.
The sounds from the direction of the cistern were now terrifyingly close. The crisp crack, crack, crack of pulse rifle fire was no longer an echo, but a sharp, immediate threat. He could hear the barked orders of a BCA squad leader, the voice distorted by a helmet speaker. Advance. Sterilize on contact. No quarter. Then came the roar. The whoosh of the flamethrower was a physical presence, a wave of heat that traveled down the corridor and washed over him. The screaming of the crowd pitched higher, turning from fear into pure agony. A new smell joined the ozone and the damp, the sweet, sickening stench of cooking meat, of burning hair. Joric craned his neck, his cheek pressed to the cold, wet metal. He could see the end of the corridor now, where the mob was thinnest. A stark white light cut through the gloom, the headlamp of a BCA enforcer's helmet, then another and another, a line of them advancing, shoulder to shoulder, their black armor impervious, their faceplates reflecting the orange glow of the flames. They were monsters from the ideology of structured survivalism, faceless, remorseless angels of order. The man in the center raised his weapon. The pilot light flickered. The people at the back of the mob, the ones closest to the death squad, tried to turn back, but there was no room. They clawed at the backs of those in front of them, their faces a canvas of ultimate despair. They were being crushed between the stampede and the fire. And Joric was caught in the middle. He was a rock in the stream, with the terrified mob pushing against one side and a wall of fire advancing on the other. He couldn't move forward, he couldn't move back. The enforcer's helmet turned, its blank black faceplate sweeping across the chaos, and for a moment it felt like it paused, looking directly at him. There was no recognition, no humanity, just a target to be sterilized.
The air tasted of ozone and cooked metal. Panic was a fist closing around Joric's throat, squeezing the breath from his lungs. Pinned behind the rusted housing of a defunct atmospheric condenser, he watched the beams of BCA searchlights slice through the perpetual gray mist of the cistern platform. Their mag boots were heavy, magnetic impacts on the grated floor, a sound that promised sterile cuffs and a final quiet trip to the reclamation vats. Salt rot. He was a forensic theologian, a man of intellect and observation. Not a soldier, not a runner. Every instinct screamed at him to stay small, to become one with the corroded metal, but the disciplined sweep of the light beams told him it was only a matter of seconds. Then, a different sound, a sharp metallic scrape from directly beneath him. He flinched, pressing himself harder against the condenser. A new threat? A mutated eelhound from the lower sumps. Cantor. The voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the hum of the distant water pumps and the approaching storm of BCA enforcers. It came from the floor. A hand, gloved and grimy, shot up through the grate, fingers beckoning with urgent, spidery movements. Down! Now! Morrow! Before his mind could fully process the impossibility of it, a section of the grate tilted inward with a groan of tortured metal. The hand seized the front of his jacket and with the strength that belied her wiry frame, pulled him down. There was no choice, no time for argument. The world inverted. The orange emergency lighting of the cistern vanished, replaced by absolute suffocating blackness. Cold, foul-smelling water shocked his system as he plunged into it, the impact stealing the last of his air. He came up sputtering, his hands flailing and finding only slimy curved walls. The grate slammed shut above him, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Total darkness. The stench was overwhelming, a thick, cloying cocktail of human waste, chemical runoff, and something anciently organic, like millennia of decay concentrated into a single breath. He was in a sewage conduit. A pure, physical wave of revulsion washed over him, a primal rejection of the filth he, an Aerie dweller, was now submerged in. "Quiet," Morrow's voice hissed, right beside his ear. Her hand found his shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. "Don't make a sound."
Above them, the heavy tread of the patrol arrived. Thump, thump, thump. The mag boots resonated through the pipe. A vibration felt deep in Joric's bones. He could hear their voices, muffled by the duracrete and steel. "Spore signature is off the charts here," one voice grunted. "No sign of the primary target." "Found these Hymners, though," said another. A sharp metallic click. Joric knew that sound, a pulse rifle's charge cell locking into place. There was no command, no warning, just a series of sharp, high-energy cracks. Fzit, fzit, fzit. The sounds were oddly flat, robbed of their echo by the cavernous cistern space above. There was no screaming. The Hymners, lost in their fungal bliss, probably never even knew what was happening. Joric's stomach churned. He fought the urge to vomit, the bile rising in his throat. Moreau's grip tightened on his shoulder, a silent command to hold it together. He could feel her shift beside him in the thigh-deep sludge, her attention completely focused upwards. The boots moved again, their rhythm slow, methodical, hunting. Joric held his breath, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The water around him was unnervingly warm in places, a sign of unprocessed chemical effluent. He imagined what unseen things were brushing against his legs, what parasites were burrowing into his skin. His meticulously maintained Aerie purity, his life's work of sterile detachment, all of it was being stripped away, dissolved in the city's literal excrement. "Move," Moreau breathed, her voice barely a disturbance in the air. She gave him a shove. "Stay behind me. Touch the left wall. Only the left wall." He didn't ask why. He obeyed. His gloved fingers met a surface slick with a greasy, fibrous film. He shuffled forward, the viscous water resisting every step. Each slosh and ripple felt like a shout in the crushing silence. Moreau moved ahead of him with an unnatural quiet, a creature born to the subterranean darkness. She wasn't waiting, she was gliding, her feet finding purchase on the curved floor with an instinct he could never possess. The patrol shadowed them from above. Their footsteps were a constant, terrifying metronome. Joric focused on the small patch of Morrow's back he could barely make out, a slightly darker shape in the profound black. He thought of his instruments, his spore sampler, his data slate, all lost. He was blind, deaf, stripped of everything that made him Joric Cantor, the debunker. Here, in the guts of Benthos, he was just meat, frightened, useless meat. They moved through the oppressive dark for what felt like an eternity. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of condensation from the conduit's ceiling, a maddeningly irregular rhythm. Joric remembered reading about the drip cant of the Gill-Racks, a language of water. Perhaps Morrow was listening to something he couldn't hear, navigating by a map of echoes and drips. Suddenly, the footsteps above stopped, directly above. Joric froze, his body rigid. Morrow's hand shot back and flattened against his chest, holding him in place. He could hear her controlled breathing, a stark contrast to the ragged, panicked gasps he was trying to suppress. The silence stretched, becoming a physical pressure. Joric's mind, starved of sensory input, started to create its own. He saw flashes of his daughter's face in the dark, her smile impossibly bright against the filth. A hallucination? A memory? The spores he'd inhaled earlier were at work, weaving their deadly poetry in the fabric of his sanity. A sharp rap echoed from above, someone striking the floor grate, testing it.
Joric's blood ran cold. He squeezed his eyes shut. This is it. They'd be like rats in a drain pipe, cornered and helpless. Then a muffled command. Negative. Channel's collapsed 100 meters on. Waste of time. Move out. The mag boots started up again, their rhythm quicker now, less searching, more purposeful. They were leaving. The sound of their thumping grew fainter and fainter until it was finally swallowed by the low-frequency hum of the city's heartbeat. Joric let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for a full minute. His legs felt weak, threatening to buckle. He leaned heavily against the slimy wall. Mora waited another 30 seconds, a testament to her sump diver's patience. Then she spoke, her whisper still sharp and professional.
That was a purity sweep. Commander Rask's unit. They don't take prisoners.
She didn't need to elaborate. The flat cracks of the pulse rifles had told him everything. Where are we going? Joric managed, his voice a hoarse croak. She moved again, her form disappearing into the gloom ahead. He scrambled to follow, terrified of being left alone. To a place they can't follow, she said, the words echoing slightly as the conduit opened up. The sump rat's path, the only way down from here. Stay dry. He heard the ghost of bitter irony in her voice. Ahead, a faint, sickly green light began to bloom, outlining a rusted ladder ascending into a vertical shaft. The light wasn't from an emergency lamp, it was organic, the pervasive bioluminescence of the deeper levels. The light of the murmuration. He was alive. He was safe, for now. But as he took his first step out of the foul water and onto the ladder, he realized Morrow hadn't just saved his life. She had pulled him out of the city he knew and dragged him into hers. He was no longer the investigator. He was the baggage. And they were going deeper into the god's embrace. The groan of rusted metal was the only sound that mattered. It was the sound of a closing mouth, a final seal between the world that hunted them and the sliver of darkness they now occupied. Morrow threw her weight against the circular hatch, her grunts lost in the metallic shriek. It slammed shut with a deep resonating boom that vibrated through the wet concrete under Joric's trembling knees. For a full 10 seconds the only sound was their own breathing. His, a ragged, tearing gasp for air that tasted of rust and stale water. Hers, a rhythmic pant like a predator that had just finished a long chase. He was on all fours in a cramped maintenance conduit, the corrugated floor biting into his palms. His entire body was a symphony of agony. The muscles in his legs screamed from a desperate flight through catwalks and down algae-slick ladders. A sharp pain lanced through his ribs with every panicked breath, but none of it registered with the same screaming intensity as the object clutched in his right hand. His fingers, numb and white-knuckled, were fused around the plasteel cylinder of the sample container. Thorne's last gift. Thorne's death warrant. His own.
Get up. Morrow's voice was flat, stripped of all emotion, save for a hard, practical edge. A beam from her headlamp cut through the oppressive dark, splashing against the far wall of a small, spherical chamber. It was a pressure regulation node, long abandoned. Cables thick with calcified grime hung like dead vines from the ceiling, and the ever-present heartbeat of the city's pumps was a low guttural thrum that felt like it was coming from inside his own skull. The air was thick, carrying the cloying honey and rot perfume of the murmuration, a scent that now seemed permanently stitched into the lining of his lungs. Joric forced his limbs to obey. He pushed himself up, his back scraping against the curved, weeping wall. He leaned there, the cold dampness seeping through his thin jacket, and finally allowed himself to look.
He raised the container into the thin beam of Moro's light. Inside, suspended in the viscous preservation gel, was a piece of mycelium. It wasn't just a fungus. It was a lattice of impossibly fine filaments, each one glowing with a faint, greasy blue light. As he watched, a pulse of green traveled from one end to the other, a slow, deliberate wave of bioluminescence. It was a synaptic fire, a thought, proof. "It's a learning entity, Joric," Thorne's voice echoed in his memory, a ghost in the machine of his own mind. "It reacts, it thinks." He could still see the look on his mentor's face just before Kalen's enforcers had. Joric squeezed his eyes shut. The image of Thorne's body, limp and broken on the lab floor, was burned onto the back of his eyelids. All that knowledge, all that desperate work, atomized in a single brutal moment. Everything lost, except for this one tiny piece of undeniable truth. He opened his eyes again, his gaze locked on the pulsing light. It was beautiful, utterly, terrifyingly beautiful. He felt a strange proprietary pride mixed with a nauseating wave of terror. He had it, the thing that could bring the whole rotten structure of the BCA down. The evidence that their whispering sickness wasn't a pathogen to be cured, but an intelligence to be negotiated with, or eradicated. She was methodically checking the seals on the hatch, her movements economical and precise. She didn't look at him. "There's no room for ghosts down here, theologian. The dead are dead. It's the living that will kill you." She finished her check and turned, her lamp's beam pinning him against the wall. Her face was a mask of grime and exhaustion, but her eyes were sharp, calculating. She was weighing him, assessing his worth now that the contract was ash and the mission was a flight for survival. Her gaze flicked down to the sample in his hand, then back to his face. "You got what you came for," she stated. It wasn't a question. Was it worth it? The question hung in the humid air. Was it worth Thorne's life, the destruction of the only real research Benthos had on the murmuration, the fact that his name and face were now plastered on every security terminal from the Aerie to the Gill-Racks? He thought of the pure clinical reason he'd taken this job, to debunk another false god, to prove once again that the universe was as empty and meaningless as the day it took his family. But looking at the living light in the vial, the cold comfort of his nihilism felt like a child's blanket in a hurricane. He couldn't form an answer. He just stared at the sample, the impossible truth of it. Moro took a step closer. The ozone tang of her stun baton tickled his nose. "You know what they're calling you up there, on the BCA security feeds?" she asked, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. "Sump-tainted, pathogenic collaborator. You're not just a fugitive, Joric. You're a disease vector, a threat to purity itself." Each word was a hammer blow. Sump-tainted, the clinical dismissive term he himself had used 100 times to categorize the lost, the hopeless, the hymners shuffling through the damp alleys, a label that stripped a person of their humanity and turned them into a problem to be cleansed. Now it was his. He was one of them, a sporehead, a ghost before he was even dead. Moro let the silence stretch, letting the weight of it settle on him. "So, congratulations, theologian," she said, the words laced with a razor-sharp irony that was almost cruel. "You're sump-tainted now. They won't stop hunting you, not Kalen, not ever. They won't stop until you're a memory wiped from a terminal." For a moment, all he felt was the crushing weight of utter despair. The relief of escape evaporated, replaced by the icy certainty of his new reality. He was trapped,
a rat in the city's metal guts, with the exterminators sealing every exit. His connection to the Aerie, his credentials, his life, all severed. He had nothing, no one, just a sump diver who looked at him like he was a ticking bomb and a piece of glowing fungus in a tube. The terror was a physical thing, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. He felt this carefully constructed world, the world of logic, of evidence, of detached observation, fracture and fall away, leaving him in a free fall. He looked from Morrow's unpitying face to the sample container in his hand. The light inside pulsed again. Green. Blue. A silent, alien thought. And in that pulse, the fear did not vanish. It changed. It transmuted. The terror remained, a cold stone in his gut, but around it something else began to crystallize. A hard, jagged anger. A purpose born not of intellectual curiosity, but of pure, desperate spite. They had taken everything from him. Forn, his research, his name. They had branded him a monster. His grip on the sample tightened. This wasn't just proof anymore. It was a weapon. It was the key to understanding the force that Kalen wanted to blindly destroy, the same force that whispered to him in the dark with his daughter's voice. They wanted to erase him. He would show them an apocalypse. He would hold the truth up to the face of their sterile, structured world and watch it burn. Joric lifted his head, meeting Morrow's gaze in the harsh glare of her lamp. The exhaustion was still etched onto his face, the terror still swimming in his eyes, but beneath it a new fire was lit, a grim, terrifying determination. "Then we'd better not become a memory," he said, his voice a low, steady rasp that surprised even himself.